Good morning, and thank you. My name is Mustafa Akyol, and before getting into more interesting stuff, let me tell a few things about myself. I'm a Turkish opinion writer, author, based in Istanbul, Turkey. And one of my passions in life, probably the most important one, is to help advance what I call Islamic liberalism. By that, I mean a reinterpretation of Islam by asserting the autonomy of the individual with the argument that faith flourishes actually genuinely only when it is based on free choice, something that the Quran emphasizes, but a lot of Muslims don't seem to care enough. And also critique of these authoritarian aspects of Islamic law, bans on apostasy, blasphemy, impiety, and all that. And I put those arguments and ideas in my 2011 book, Islam Without Extremes: A Muslim Case for Liberty, which is a good read, by the way, if you're interested in books. And I had a lot of theological or jurisprudence-based arguments there, and I stand by them. But in one of the chapters of the book, I also had a contemporary argument. I said, contemporary Turkey is a good example in which we can see an Islamic liberalism unfolding. Now, I'll be honest, I wrote that like some 4 years ago, and since I wrote that, Turkey didn't exactly prove my point. And it rather looks like a illiberal democracy today, at best, rather than a liberal democracy. And here's a little bit short summary of what happened and why that happened. Well, first of all, I should tell you why I thought that Turkey could offer a case of Islamic liberalism, an example, a model. In early 2000s, Turkey was ruled by the Justice and Development Party, AKP with Turkish initials. And this was a party that came from an Islamist background, but reformed itself, recast itself actually on the model of European Christian Democrats, wanted to bring Turkey into the European Union, bring the European Union criteria, do liberal reforms. And the party began with these promises, and it actually did a really good job in the first term, and even maybe the second one. But looking now, I think some people in the party really believed in this liberal narrative and the synthesis of that with Islamic values. Other people saw it as just a necessity, political necessity. Why it was necessary for them? Turkey was under the thumb of secular generals, secular but not liberal. Not every secular actor is a liberal in the world. And they were threatening elected governments, and EU looked like a life tube, and EU criteria, the Copenhagen criteria, looked like a life tube out of that. I think, looking today, being honest, there were two important men that founded the AKP, Abdullah Gül and Tayyip Erdoğan. Mr. Gül became president later, and now he's retired. I think he really believed in this liberal democracy criteria and this Islamic liberal synthesis. Whereas Mr. Erdoğan, who's our current president, I think saw it as a necessity. And when Mr. Erdoğan had full power, subdued the military in 2010-11, he didn't need those Copenhagen criteria anymore. In a few years, democracy became redefined as nothing but elections. And the winner of the elections can dominate every space in society, from universities to media to ultimately judiciary, that to come later. And that's why after 2011 in Turkey, we began to see a resurgence of the Islamist narrative that the AKP had supposedly abandoned, with some promises to nurture a more religious society. Whereas I think the more you do that, the society becomes more hypocritical, so it's not even serving religion to have this state-created religiosity. And this culminated in a reaction among Turkey's more secular people against the government. And that reaction exploded in an event that nobody expected before. It was the Turkish version of a lot of springs and orange revolutions in a different part of the world. It was the Gezi Park event. The Gezi Park is a small, not so nice actually, park in the middle of Istanbul, but it is a park. And Erdoğan decided in 2013 to demolish the park, rebuild a Ottoman military barracks, turn into a shopping mall, and that was everything the left hated. Ottomanism with some capitalism combined, crony capitalism actually. And a lot of left-wing groups and environmentalists gathered at the park to protest against this government decision. And I did not agree with everything they wanted or everything they said, but these people two rights, I think. First, they had a right to free assembly and protest and have their views. Secondly, I think they deserve to be understood. But Mr. Erdogan and the government around him, actually Mr. Erdogan personally, decided that no, they should be dispersed by the police using tear gas. And that's why Istanbul looked like a place of a tear gas heaven in those days, the center of Istanbul. And also, and I think that was the key moment, he decided that these are not protesters who are unhappy with the government for some understandable reason, because the government is wonderful. Why would you think the government has something wrong? They are rather spies working for foreign governments and some nefarious powers out there to destabilize Turkey, topple the regime, and bring down this glorious new Turkey to its knees. So they were evil people. And if they are spies and evil people and conspirators, what do? You stand tough against them. That became the narrative of the Turkish government since the Gezi Park protests in a very steadily increasing pace. Since then, since the Gezi Park events, every obstacle the government has faced has been depicted by the government and the pro-government media as a conspiracy cooked up by Zionists, Freemasons, CIA, the interest rate lobby, something we had not heard before. And we could not even spot who are these people. But this demonization propaganda has kept going on. And I think here as a note, that conspiratorial interpretation of the world is one of the key components of any authoritarianism. That's why it should be studied carefully. Karl Popper did it very well in his books. And I think it's in Turkey, it's elsewhere. And once you get into that conspiratorial thinking, it ultimately, inevitably leads to more authoritarian behavior. Everything since then has been interpreted like that, including an intra-state conflict between an Islamic group that actually Erdogan had empowered within the judiciary and the police, then went against him, and he said, okay, this is yet another Zionist conspiracy against us, rather than understanding the nature of the conflict, maybe which could lead to some better reconciliation. And thanks to that particular conflict, we also got into a mood of redesigning the judiciary by the government, which is actually gradually making judiciary a handmaiden of the executive. Now, at this point, people ask me, like, do you think Turkey will become another Iran, another Sharia-thumping, like a Saudi Arabia? And my answer is not really. Mr. Erdogan has a religious nationalism, some Islamist narrative, but it's not that far-fetched. But we might be ending up becoming another Russia, and that's not a great model either. And that's why we should be careful about where we're heading Turkey. Now, I'll give you an example of how this paranoid authoritarianism, as I call it, works with regards to the media in Turkey, and because that's a part of the scene. On the one hand, Turkey is not a dictatorship. You have a lot of newspapers with different views. In Istanbul, there are 25 newspapers printed every day with different points of views, with different ideologies. So you have to give them that. It's not that a regime that silences press right away. But the devil is in the details. If you look at the history of Turkish media in the past 10 years, you will see that at least 7 newspapers, as I counted, changed hands suddenly because they collapsed, the government bought them, and somebody else bought the newspaper. And the new people who bought the newspaper turned out to be the best friends, even some relatives of President Erdogan. And once they got this newspaper, they decided to hire a lot of reporters or columnists who were critical of the government. Which now gives a message to any Turkish journalist today that if you're critical of the government, you will not end up in jail. This is not North Korea. But you will lose your job, probably. And you can write in a blog, but you will probably not be making money for yourself, a life for yourself. So that's the kind of message that is right now given to Turkish media. In the meantime, the pro-government media expanded, and the pro-government, actually maybe it's fair to say Mr. Pro-Erdogan media, because it's really a big devotion to a persona. And you don't have to read Turkish to see that. When you get these paper in your hands, you can see them visually, that they are really big on the great leader and the amazing vision that he brings to our society. Here are some examples. And again, the fact that these papers exist, one thing. The fact that other newspapers are being intimidated and suffocated is another thing. One recent example, just from last week. a newspaper named Hürriyet, which is a main liberal-leaning centrist daily in Turkey, the top-selling one, ran a headline last week about the death penalty given to Mohamed Morsi by the Sisi regime in Egypt, which is a bloody tyranny, by the way, the Sisi regime, which is giving death penalties to its political opponents and killing people in streets when they're peacefully protesting. But whatever. The Sisi regime did that. There was this death penalty. And Hürriyet reported about this. But the title was, "The World is in Shock. Death penalty given to a president who was elected with 52% of the votes." Now, what do you understand from that? That looks like a factual report of an event in Egypt, right? But Mr. Erdogan and his people understood something different. They said, why did you put this headline? Erdogan is conspicuously elected by 52% of the votes as well. So you're actually implying that Erdogan will be executed after a military coup that you will cook up, right? Hürriyet was publicly condemned by Mr. Erdogan, by Prime Minister Davutoglu, the media for this, and a pro-government lawyer sued Hürriyet for this headline for inciting armed rebellion against the government. And we will see whether Hürriyet will be on trial for this interesting accusation, to put it mildly. That is the scene, and again, where we'll end up is interesting. It's a story, actually, which began nicely, but I think throughout this period, we liberals learned what does it mean that power corrupts and how it unfolds. And also, we have seen that more intellectual work is needed in Turkey to understand what liberal democracy is today, what liberal democracy is, rather than thinking that elections are only the way. Yet, I still hope that this is a bottleneck that we are passing through, and at the end of which there will be a more liberal democratic Turkey. After all, we have a democratic tradition that goes back to late Ottoman Empire, and Turks are not new to this. But also, we have something in our political genes which makes us fall into these godfathers, like the founding, caring father to the nation. It could be Ataturk, the secular version, and these days Mr. Erdogan. But when we mature as a nation, I think, we will lead less godfathers, and we will become more, I think, autonomous individuals. Thank you.